Good evening. Welcome to Q&A. I'm Tony Jones, and here to answer your questions tonight, former Deputy Prime Minister and Ambassador to the Vatican, Tim Fischer, the Shadow Minister for Foreign Affairs, Tanya Plibersek, John Howard's trusted Chief of Staff, now Senator Arthur Sinodinos, historian Carolyn Holbrook, who questions the way we celebrate Anzac Day in her book Anzac, the Unauthorised Biography, and the Deputy Program Director of Human Rights Watch, Tom Porteous. Please welcome our panel. Thank you. Now, remember, if you've got a live Twitter question, just add @Quanda to help us find it among all the other ones. Now, our Facebook audience suggested we talk about Anzac, tax policy, ICAC, and the imminent executions in Indonesia. We'll come to Anzac soon. Let's go straight to our first question, which is from Carmini Krishnan.
In 27 hours, our friend Mayu, Andrew, and 7 others will be led to a firing range and shot dead. This morning it emerged that a judge asked for $130,000 in exchange for a lighter sentence. These are serious allegations. They need to be investigated and the executions need to be halted. What do we do when law and diplomacy have failed? The principles of justice and equality have proven enough for France and Europe to take a strong stand. Should Tony Abbott, our Prime Minister, advocate as strongly as the French, the Philippines and the Indonesians?
Arthur Sinodinos.
Well, Carmini, that's a very important question because people's lives are at stake. At the beginning of this process, I underestimated how strongly community sentiment in Australia had moved on this issue. To see the vigils that have occurred across the country, the spontaneous outpouring of concern, I think part of it is because we've gotten to know the individuals involved in a way that perhaps in some other cases we haven't, and we've got to see their story and their journey and the way in which they appear to have been rehabilitated, and how, in the paradox of what appears to be a chaotic Indonesian prison system, they seem to have come to a point where they are actually mentoring and counselling others. And this makes it very hard when you look someone like that in the eye, who appears to have repented, if I can use that sort of religious expression, to then say, well, they just deserve to die anyway. And you're right that we should be doing everything we can. The Australian government, the opposition, I think, have been very strong on this in seeking to make high-level representations. At every stage where there's been a legal issue that's been raised, the Australian government, the opposition and others have made the point these need to be fully resolved before we move to any next step. And you're right, there were issues raised today which raised some fundamental questions about the judicial process that was undertaken in these cases. Now, there's been talk through the newspapers, and today Julie Bishop alluded to this, that further actions could be taken in due course, including withdrawing the ambassador and the rest of it. I don't know what's going to happen. But
have due course, though. We've got 27 hours and we can't go back.
I understand.
I'm just going to interrupt. I'm sorry to interrupt you here, and it may be news you want to hear as well. In fact, it certainly will be, but we're just getting reports, and it's coming up on the auto cue here. Indonesia's Constitutional Court has agreed to consider a last-ditch legal challenge brought by the Bali 9 pair. The court agrees to hear the case on May the 12th. So,
well, so that does that mean? Yeah.
Go ahead, sorry.
Does that's wonderful news, but does that mean that they are not going to go ahead with tomorrow? Is that what it means? Because no one's talking to the family. I've spoken, you know, they had a harrowing day, delayed for 3.5 hours, only allowed to see the boys for 5 hours. Does that mean that they're not going to go ahead with the...
Well, I would assume so, given the news that we've just been told.
Okay, so they're going to have that court date.
Which is, again, this issue of continuing to fully exhaust all the legal processes. This is a very welcome development.
My question again will be, though, that, say, you know, up till now, they've been very, you know, they haven't been willing to look at a lot of the legal arguments. You know, we know in their constitution that they can allow a reprieve and commute a life sentence if a prisoner has shown that they have rehabilitated. But even regardless of that, we're talking about really basic issues of equality and justice. I can list you off cases, I won't do it to bore everyone, but I can list you off cases where there's been corruption. In other cases, I can list you worse crimes, worse drug crimes, where they have got lighter sentences or even been released.
Let's just hear from our panel on that, and we'll try and absorb the information that we've just received as well.
I just want to know, after the 12th, what's going to happen if we get a no. I don't want the family, I don't want the boys to be back in this situation, and the other 7.
Yes, well, I mean, the fact that an appeal sounds like it's being heard doesn't mean they'll win the appeal. It just means a delay, really, and another procedure. But let's hear from Tanya Plibersek.
Thank you for raising this issue. It is a really important issue and troubling many Australians. And I'm sorry, Tony, just having read that on the auto cue, I think we have to be very careful. We don't know the full range of information. We might hear updates through the course of the show or afterwards.
Yeah, it's just a media report at this stage, so we should bear that in mind.
We just have to be very careful because the information is, as you've said, is coming out in small pieces. From the very beginning, we have said that all of the legal processes must be allowed to run their course. And certainly there are still 2 outstanding legal processes underway. There's the Judicial Commission legal process and there's also another legal process in the Constitutional Court. They must be allowed to be completed. We've said that all along. We've also said that the case of Myron Sukumaran and Andrew Chan is a fantastic example of the success of the Indonesian judicial system in allowing rehabilitation after 10 years in jail. These young men have not just turned their own lives around, they've been a positive influence on the lives of other prisoners. They've had the support of the jail governor in Bali saying exactly that. It seems particularly cruel after they've made such efforts to reform themselves to impose this sentence. It's not just a sentence on these young men, it's a sentence on anyone who knows them, anybody who loves them. While they're alive, they can repay their debt to society. Nobody's suggesting that there should be no punishment. It was a very serious crime, but while they are alive, they can continue to repay their debt to society. I'd also say more generally that Can I just bring you to the original point in the question, which was about the corruption allegations now being made against the judges. I mean, we haven't got the detail from the information we've got, but perhaps that is the very thing that's caused the appeal. And Tony, I think we need to be a little bit careful on how we handle this now. And I think the best way of handling it is to allow the Indonesian court processes to be completed. There's a lot of scrutiny on these court cases at the moment, and they should be allowed to run their course.
Tim Fischer.
I'm totally opposed to capital punishment. They broke Indonesian sovereign law, as Tanya's just admitted, and yet it should not be a death penalty. It should be a penalty for the term of their natural life, so they can continue the good work they're doing in more recent times. One other point, briefly. I think the media's got a very difficult role to play here. Yes, they must keep us up to date, and this program is updating Australia as we speak, as breaking news comes through. But we don't want a media over-the-top circus on this matter. It's not going to be helpful to the families of Andrew and Myron or anybody else in the circumstances.
Tom.
I'm the only person on this panel who lives in a country, the United States. It's not my country, I'm from the UK, but I live in the United States, which has the death penalty. I can tell you it is sobering to walk around in a country where the death penalty exists. The death penalty is an act of total savagery, whether it's firing squad, gas, beheading, hanging. And Human Rights Watch stands utterly opposed to it. But not only is it savage, it's also ineffective as a deterrent. We have the issue of judicial fallibility combined with the irreversibility of the death sentence, which creates a huge problem, and innocents are likely to die in any country where there is the death penalty, however careful you are, and it has happened in the past. To answer your question, Carmini, it's in the hands of the Indonesian government at the moment, this particular case. But I think what the Australian government can do and what nations around the world that oppose the death penalty rightly should do is to get together and campaign more strongly against the death penalty with those countries that still have it, including the United States of America, and certainly Australia could be part of that.
Tom, does Human Rights Watch have an opinion on, or a position, if you may put it that way, on the Indonesian justice system and its worth or fallibility?
Well, I think we've done some work on the Indonesian justice system, and we've criticised it in the past. I think it's worth noting that just a few weeks ago, in fact this year, and for the second time a few weeks ago, an Indonesian maid in Saudi Arabia was beheaded, and the Indonesian government made a bit of a stink about that to the Saudis. But obviously they were not on very good ground to do that, because they themselves maintain the right to judicially kill people under their jurisdiction.
And Tony, that's been, I think, a very important point in this debate. Indonesia has more than 200 people of its own citizens on death row in other countries, and we have said to the Indonesian government that it does weaken their ability to make that argument with other governments.
Can I just ask you this, Tanya Plibersek, if the executions were to go ahead, would that mean we would have to re-evaluate our relationship not only with Indonesia but particularly with President Widodo?
Tony, I think it's very important now that the government and the opposition in Australia focus on ensuring that these legal processes are allowed to be properly concluded, and I think any discussion about what might happen after is best left till after.
I'm definitely taking that into account. I definitely want the best for the boys, but it has raised, maybe it's a philosophical question, I'm not sure, but when we can see an inconsistent application of justice, what is our, I mean, how do we deal with that? You know, our society stands by law, justice, diplomacy. How they have to be the most important things of any society. Otherwise, everything else will crumble. So, you know, of the cases where there have been other sentences passed where they didn't get execution, they didn't get life, and they were in charge of ice factories, or they, you know, ex-police officers who 5 ex-police officers who just got the sack and didn't get a death penalty. You know, how do you know? I've been speaking to young kids. How are they supposed to understand the notion of justice? And the young Indonesians. There's young Indonesians who don't support this as well. You know, there's an amazing group of people who are being brave.
We can encourage them, but these are matters sovereign to Indonesia. And we can highlight our onward campaign against capital punishment and against the justice system of Indonesia, and for that matter, the justice system of the USA, which Tom has just alluded to, has some mighty pitfalls in it as well. But we are Australia, and I think Tanya has said correctly that step by step, the government of the day will determine what happens as a reaction, but don't give up. Do not give up, and let's see what happens.
Well, for the first time, there may be some hope, according to media report. But let's move to another subject now. The next question is a video. It's from Mira Fernandez in Ashburton, Victoria.
The earthquake in Nepal has caused devastation, with casualties in the thousands and many parts of the country destroyed. So far, Australia has pledged minimal monetary aid and sent a rescue team focused only on rescuing Australians. On Anzac Day, Tony Abbott sent a message of thanks to the Gurkhas who fought alongside Australians in Gallipoli. Why has the Australian government not been more involved with sending supplies, medical aid and rescue missions, specifically for the people of Nepal?
I'll start with Tanya Plibersek.
Well, Tony, I think that we should do more. This has been a shocking natural disaster. The scale of it continues to, the reports continue to see an increased death toll and increased injury toll. Our support is pretty modest at $5 million. I know a lot of Australians will want to, in addition, make individual donations, but I certainly think that we could. I certainly think we could do more. The
government, of course, says it's considering its position. This is an initial response, an emergency first response.
And we welcome the support that has already been sent, but we have some very highly skilled professionals, and I know that they would be very eager to go and to offer support. There are reports of shortages of medicines and medical supplies. That's another area where we might be able to help. we should be supporting international efforts and coordinating with other countries. I think it's quite right that the government has said that that is part of their planning, but so far our help is quite modest for the scale of the disaster.
Arthur Sinodinos, it is modest. Is that just the beginning?
Well, it is the beginning in the sense that the response team that's been sent there, in part, is assessing what more is going to be required. So you make a down payment, you assess the situation. Part of the challenge there is that the rescue operations on the ground appear to have been a bit fragmented. A lot of it seems to be citizens themselves taking it on themselves to conduct the rescue. The military and the police, to some extent, have been at loss as to what to do and what to direct. Now, this will, because it's such a big shock, this will all start to firm up in the next little while. So there is scope for us to do more. And Tanya is right to say Australians can be very generous in these sorts of circumstances, but the Australian government will put in what is required, and there will be moves within the Australian government to make sure that that is the case. From a longer term perspective, we also have to think about how we contribute to the restoration of some of the very traditional buildings that have been affected by what's happened. And there's a real dilemma around how you restore some of those buildings in a culturally appropriate way, because it would be a shame that as a result of this natural disaster, Nepal loses some of that unique flavour and character. Now, that's not just a challenge for Australia, but as a first world country with top-class engineering and other talent and design talent, that is something potentially we can also contribute to.
Carolyn.
Well, I mean, I support what Arthur said about that, about the government's intentions. I welcome the fact that they've contributed the $5 million so far and are assessing the situation, hopefully contributing more. The one thing I would say is to note that this comes in the wake of the previous budget, where the government cut, I believe, about 20% of foreign aid. So I think we just need to reassess the message that we're sending, the Australia's willingness to become involved in aid in other countries, and there'll probably be some interesting political battles going on between the Foreign Minister and the Treasurer.
The $5 million is about what we've cut in aid to Nepal.
There's a sharp aspect to this, Tony, if I could just allow very quickly a lesson. We need an adequate embassy network around this country. It was because we had an embassy in Cairo, led brilliantly by Ralph King, that Peter Grester physically appeared on this program and came out of Egypt. A lot of work done by a lot of people here in Australia and DFAT and beyond. But you need embassies on the ground. We have a small embassy in Kathmandu. Glenn White's okay. The small team of the embassy workers are okay, as I was advised this afternoon, but a huge task ahead of them. In 1996, the ERC came through the door demanding that DFAT close that embassy. And I can still remember at midnight that night, ahead of the first Costello budget, Philip Flood, Alexander Downer, and with my support as well, arguing we must not close that embassy. And the argument that actually tipped it over, and we won the day, was the fact it has to handle Australian body bags. This country is big enough to maintain an adequate embassy network around the world. We must continue to do so.
Tom, Porteous is going to have to be a huge global response. One of the more impoverished nations of the world, and this is a shattering blow.
It's an absolute terrible tragedy, and this is a country that is already very poor. It's been racked with conflict in the past, very serious human rights abuses. We've reported on it a lot. And I think this underlines the point that although there's going to be a need for an immediate response, an emergency response, there's also going to be a need for a continuation of long-term development assistance to this country to get it back on its feet, not just because of this latest tragedy, but because of the conflict and the poverty of the past. And that, I think, speaks to the need for Australia to have an aid budget which matches its wealth and its international stature. Yeah,
Arthur, you might want to respond to the two panellists suggesting that the cutting of the aid budget was a fundamental error.
Well, the aid budget's been cut for a number of years under governments of both persuasions, and we can have a further debate about all of that. But in circumstances where you're trying to put the budget back into the black, to completely exempt an area like foreign aid, I don't think would have ultimately been with the support of the public, to be honest.
Tony, I need to respond to that. We almost doubled the aid budget in government. We went from $2.9 billion to about 5.8, I think. Since coming to government, this government's cut $11 billion. In the last budget, it was $1 in every 5 of savings. It's taken us to the lowest level as a proportion of GNI in Australia's history. We're at about 0.22% of GNI now. That means like 22 cents in every $100 of our national wealth. On this trajectory, we're going down to 0.18 or 0.19, so 18 cents or 19 cents in every $100, when previously our bipartisan aim was to get to 50 cents in $100. So I don't think, Arthur, it's fair to undervalue or underplay the size of the
your government put
cuts.
off achieving those goals, remember?
We delayed it slightly because of the global financial crisis, but
Yeah,
we
yeah,
doubled
that's
the
exactly
aid
right.
budget. We doubled the aid budget, Arthur, and you've cut $11 billion.
And you slowed down the rate of growth. And what's happening now is the aid continues to rise, but it does not rise at the rate at which was projected earlier.
It will fall as a share of our national wealth. It rose every year under us as a share of our national wealth.
OK, I'm going to draw a line under that because we've got so many other questions to get through. Here's one from Lauren White.
We mourn the deaths of journalists in France for the parodying of Islam in Je suis Charlie, and bound together to show our support for freedom of speech. In a direct contradiction of what we supported in Je suis Charlie, this week, an Australian journalist's tweet about Anzac Day were deemed so controversial that he was sacked. Are we being simply too patriotic to fight for his freedom of speech?
Carolyn Holbrook, let's start with you.
Yeah, thanks, Lauren. That's a good and interesting question. My initial thought about that is that, well, for a start, it was inappropriate what the guy tweeted. Not just the timing of it, but also the sentiments that he expressed in those tweets. There were historical inaccuracies to say that it was an empire invading a nation. I mean, it was a lot more complex than that. It was 2 empires bumping up against each other. The Ottoman Empire had attacked the Russian fleet in the Black Sea. Therefore, to say that Britain and Australia invaded a sovereign nation doesn't really capture the wider context of the war.
So that may be an historical inaccuracy. Is it a sacking offence? Now, SBS said there were 3 highly inappropriate, disrespectful comments that he made. What do you identify as being sackable offences?
Well, OK, so he talked about the people who were enjoying celebrating Anzac Day. He talked about those people being poorly read, nationalist, gamblers and boozers. Which is the part of that that's not true? No, I'm saying that seriously. I mean, poorly read is certainly, you could argue, disparaging. The other things, you know, they're not necessarily untrue. No, it's way too simplistic. I mean, certainly there is an element of people who are attracted toward the Anzac legend who may engage in those kinds of activities. And it's certainly true there's an element of people who are attracted to Anzac who are also attracted to some of the philosophies of the far right and are a worry, actually, and in terms of their views. But a lot of people who go and commemorate, and all these people, tens of thousands of people who turned up on Anzac Day, you can't insult them by just putting them under the banner of poorly read and boozers and gamblers. The other thing I would say about it is that this bloke had 30,000 Twitter followers, 30,000 Twitter followers, by virtue of the fact that he was an SBS sports journalist. I mean, he could have perhaps made those tweets in a private capacity, or he could have abided by SBS policy when he was told to remove the tweets. Apparently the reason he was sacked is because he didn't abide by the policy and remove the tweets. And so that would be my first reaction, the timing and the sentiment, and then going against his workplace laws.
Tom Porteous, looking at this as an outsider?
Well, in a democracy, people should be able to say what they want. Just because it's an inappropriate timing, there's no reason why. In fact, in some ways, it's especially important that people should be able to criticise the Anzacs on Anzac Day in a free society. But you know, the question is, did he breach his company's policies? And you know, and the question of whether he should be sacked or not is really related to that, rather than anything else. But, you know, I mean, he's not being prosecuted. But so I support his right to tweet what he wants. I think it's healthy to criticise national legends, even the foundational myth. But as to whether he should have been sacked or not, that's really up to his company. I mean, my company has guidelines, and I probably would have been in serious trouble if I tweeted something like that.
Arthur Sinodinos, the questioner asks, are we being too patriotic to fight for Scott McIntyre's freedom of speech?
No, I think the man showed extremely poor judgment. He intended to be offensive. He achieved that. He was doing it. He's not a journalist. He's a paid football commentator at SBS, or he was. He was doing it with the SBS logo all over this thing. So as Tom and others have pointed out, he was doing this in a context where he was presenting himself as an employee of SBS, which under its charter is actually out there trying to promote community harmony, actually trying to find ways of bringing people together. And he's out there ranting and raving like this as an official representative of SBS. Now, he can do whatever he likes in his spare time, and Tom's right. He should be allowed to say whatever he wants and people should be able to refute it. But to take advantage of the platform you are on to reach 30,000 people in this way, I object to. I think he showed poor judgment.
Arthur, we've got a Twitter question. It's to you. It's from Shane 25873. Would he have been fired if Malcolm Turnbull didn't step in?
Now my information on this, and I've got a scoop for you, because I spoke to Malcolm about this tonight. Malcolm did ring or talk to Michael Abid, the Managing Director of SBS, to bring to his attention that he had received representations about this and that this matter was blowing up in the Twitter sphere. He left it with Abid, and then it became a matter of judgment for the SBS management as to what to do in those circumstances. Malcolm did not suggest that the bloke be sacked, but he did bring it to his attention that that is true.
We've got a questioner over here with his hand up. Go ahead.
I agree with Tom. I think some of the criticisms that Scott McIntyre made were aimed at more the jingoism and the militarism of what is, I guess, a dominant national myth, as you say. And the worry for me is that if we can't divorce our sense of sentimentality about this from our political will to openly criticise Australia's participation in wars, both past, present and future, I mean, is that something that we really want in a liberal democracy like Australia?
Let's ask Tanya Plibersek.
Well, to go to the broader point you're making about the ability to criticise our involvement in conflict, I think that's incredibly important in a democracy. And I think if you take the involvement of Australia in the 2003 invasion of Iraq, we would have done much better to have listened to the massive number of Australians who were critical of our involvement in that conflict. And you could make that point about a number of conflicts we've been involved in the past.
Can I just go to the tweets themselves? Because in one, Scott McIntyre refers to the summary. He says actually remembering the summary execution, widespread rape and theft committed by these in inverted commas brave Anzacs in Egypt, Palestine, and Japan. Do you think he overstepped the mark, and was it a sackable offence?
Well, I certainly don't think his comments were appropriate. I think it's for the SBS management to decide whether he's breached any workplace policies. I mean, I'm glad we live in a country where he can say it and nobody's going to knock on the door in the middle of the night. Whether he's borne too high a price, I think that's for other people to judge.
You don't have an opinion on that?
Well, I don't know enough detail about what's happened in his workplace. Has he been warned about this behaviour? Was he asked to take the tweets down, as been suggested? Is it contrary to their workplace policy? You know, how did he gather the 30,000 Twitter followers? Is it on the basis that he's a sporting commentator, not a political or historical journalist? There's, you know, more than one question to answer.
Tim Fischer.
Can I say it's offensive to the thousands, hundreds of thousands that turned out at dawn services all around this Australia to be loosely ascribed indirectly in these tweets as being gamblers, boozers and the like. The thing that gives me great hope in respect of the future of this country is indeed, amongst other things, the magnificence of those dawn services. Mulwala, Melbourne, pouring rain, thousands still stood in that pouring rain, saluting the fallen, saluting those who made the sacrifices for our country that we can be here in Q&A tonight and enjoy the peace and prosperity and progress, broadly stated, of this country. So let's not have $500,000 of litigation over this matter. He, I think, did breach his contract. He has been dealt with, and let us stay with an Anzac. It's as close to its core values, not too much commercialisation, no glorification of war, and no carnivalisation for that matter as well.
OK, so we have one more questioner with a hand up.
Much in the way that sort of this is a democratic forum where people can bring forward whichever opinions they'd like to, I think the role of a sphere like Twitter is for modern journalists to bring their opinions forward. Is it not in some way the role of a journalist to be asking, kind of making statements, perhaps not as extreme as these, but making statements that begin important conversations in society?
Carolyn.
Well, I think that, yes, it is the role of journalists to begin these important conversations, but there is a way to do these things and there's a way not to do these things. Yeah. I mean, I'm all for having a conversation about the way that we commemorate Anzac Day, the amount of money the Australian government is spending on Anzac Day. There's nothing wrong with questioning and having a debate. It's a sign of a mature democracy. It's just a question of the way this guy did it. I mean, and he does have free speech. His tweets are out there. He's not being imprisoned or prosecuted in any way. So, you know, free speech does exist. But I think he erred in the way that he went about these things. I mean, the tweet that we didn't...
Free speech and no job.
The thing we didn't talk about was that he talked about Hiroshima and Nagasaki as the largest single-day terrorist attacks, comparing them to contemporary terrorist attacks. I mean, he gives fuel to critics of SBS, right-wing critics of SBS, and also a comment like that gives fuel to young people who are confused and thinking about becoming jihadists. It's dangerous and irresponsible in my view.
I'll just bring in Tom on that. That was a pretty outrageous comment in many respects to suggest that these two atomic blasts were terrorist attacks. But there has been a lot of questioning, certainly, about the second blast, whether it was necessary or whether it was an experiment on a new bomb.
Terrorism is an extremely subjective word, but certainly the attacks on Japan at the end of the Second World War were massively indiscriminate and therefore serious violations of international humanitarian law. And tens of thousands of civilians died. So we have to accept that. The circumstances were difficult, but these were war crimes.
Carolyn, would you disagree with that?
I agree with the fact that, I mean, that the consequences in terms of the civilian deaths were absolutely devastating, but that the bombings took place within the context of a world war, and Japan was proving difficult to defeat right at the end. And I don't think you can draw a straight line between that and what's going on now with terrorists in the Middle East.
All right, we've got plenty of other questions. Sorry to those with your hands up. Our next question is a video. It's from Phil Lewis in Perth.
As a father of two boys, the eldest being 13 years old, it is extremely difficult to minimise their exposure to the very realistic imagery of modern warfare and violence in today's video games and films. This negative influence on their young and impressionable minds is further exacerbated by a society that promotes the military and celebrates its achievements. Now, none of our Anzac soldiers would have ever wished their experience on anyone. So how do we continue to respect their sacrifice without glorifying a role which no longer really represents the Anzac spirit?
Tim Fischer.
Well, let's go right back to an original Anzac. John Monash. I hate the business of war and soldiering with a loathing that I cannot describe. The awful horror of it, the death and the destruction. My only consolation has been I'm doing my duty for my country. They didn't, and neither did the East Timor, Iraq or Afghanistan veterans at any stage seek to glorify the work they're about, the difficult work they're about. They have a job to do for their country and job allocated to them, and they did it against extreme odds pretty well. So I think this is, nevertheless, the question does draw the dilemma of the publicity that you will always get for military operations, for the role of the Navy, the Army and the Air Force. And Phil, likewise, as a parent, I sense what you are driving at, but let's keep it in the perspective that we're not about glorification of war. We're about the job that the Navy, Army and Air Force has to do in order that we might enjoy our security, and our national security remains paramount in these troubled times.
So, Tim, was abhorrence of war a truer reflection of the Anzac spirit, if Monash is right?
Sorry?
Was abhorrence of war a truer reflection of the Anzac spirit, if Monash is right?
Yes and yes.
Carolyn?
Well, in answer to Phil's question, I would say there are two main things that we can do. Take away the commercialisation or control more tightly the commercialisation of Anzac. The Department of Veterans Affairs and the Minister need to police that more tightly. I'm not saying that we shouldn't have any commercialisation. I understand that the RSL needs to raise money, and it does that through campaigns with commercial companies, but we need to police that more closely. For example, I think it's highly inappropriate for the government to be in cohorts with a beer company, lending the Anzac brand to an alcohol company. And the other thing that we need to do is to get politicians to take some steps away from Anzac. No offence to politicians here, but I think that the relationship...
Why is that? What do you mean by steps away from
Well,
Anzac?
I think politicians, in terms of the history of Anzac, politicians did not historically have a close relationship with Anzac. The commemorating was done by the returned veterans themselves. It's only since Hawke went in 1990 for the 75th anniversary of the landing to Gallipoli that politicians have really jumped aboard. Malcolm Fraser said to me when I interviewed him in 2012, if I'd gone to Gallipoli, if I'd gone to Anzac Cove on Anzac Day when I was Prime Minister, people would have said, what on earth is Fraser doing? And with the exception of Paul Keating, politicians, Prime Ministers in particular, have just been as keen as mustard to associate themselves with Anzac because it's so popular.
Arthur Sinodinos, time to bring you in.
Well, Carolyn has hit on a very important point, is that to some extent politicians have reacted to the shift in community sentiment. Because I can remember when I was growing up in the 60s, I won't go any further back, and 70s, there was quite a different mood around Anzac Day. And there was a thought that over time, as the veterans left the stage, as it were, that it would tend to tail off. But there's been such a recrudescence of support and interest, including among younger people. And that is something that Hawke and others, you're right, did pick up on. And I think what we do with Anzac Day, and this is just speaking for myself, is leave aside this issue of glorification of war. I think we sort of glorify the values that underpinned what they were trying to do. And I think it's legitimate to do that, whether it's the values, personal values around their courage, their willingness to go and fight on behalf of a larger cause. You can argue the toss about the great powers of the period, but if the Germans had won, it would be a different world to the one that emerged from that period, and there were further ructions to come. But the fact of the matter is, I think that we look to Anzac not to glorify the idea that we should always be ready to go to war at the drop of a hat, but the sort of values that underpin the people that were involved, and we celebrate their sacrifice. And as Tony Abbott himself put it the other way, when these characters came back, it was like Australia went into a funeral for a decade and a half, which also, of course, covered the period of the Depression. The reason being that this conflict, because of the number of Australians involved, whether through death or through injury and coming back, it affected a lot of families in Australia. It was our first mass exposure to post-traumatic stress disorder, and we did not handle it well, and there was a lot of self-medication. And there are a lot of stories around that, and increasingly we are conscious of those effects of war. And I don't think any government lightly goes to war, to be honest.
Tom Porteous, are these debates being thrashed out in the United States and Britain, for example, with the centenary of the Great War? Absolutely.
And also, actually, just next month, we've got in the UK, we've got the 70th anniversary of VE Day, which is going to be huge celebrations throughout the UK, right after the general election. But, you know, I think that it's absolutely right that we should honour those who've fallen in wars that have been fought in the name of our countries. And I see a couple here in front who are wearing two lovely poppies on their shirts. I absolutely respect that. I think it's absolutely important. But we shouldn't allow the honouring of the dead to obscure the reality that war is absolute hell, as Tim said. We shouldn't allow it to obscure also the fact that politicians and military leaders can make mistakes. We shouldn't allow it to obscure the fact that in war, often, even on our side, as well as on the enemy's side, there are brutal atrocities and war crimes. And we shouldn't let it obscure the massive suffering that civilians suffer in times of war. And I'm afraid that the sort of political commandeering, if you like, of war celebrations, I'm worried about it because there's a danger that it's being used by the political class to avoid scrutiny for their decisions about going to war, to avoid accountability for their actions during war, and to avoid taking responsibility for the civilians who suffer during war.
We've got a question from someone who lived through a war, a particularly brutal one, the Vietnam War, Don Tate.
Sorry, I missed that question, Tony.
It's your question we're throwing to, Don. I just said at the beginning that it's a question from someone who lived through a particularly brutal war in Vietnam.
Thanks, Mr. Jones. And yeah, I am a veteran of the Vietnam War. I think the Australian public now is well aware that Australian military history is not written by the men and women who actually fight the battles. Rather, it's put to us or presented to the public by our historians and our armchair generals in a manner to make it more palatable and also to maintain the ethos of Anzac as well as the image of the bronzed Aussie digger. Now, the Australian War Memorial routinely sanitises the records of the war and removes and destroys anything that is embarrassing or potentially embarrassing to the Australian government, past or present, and or the military. So my question is this. As a man who fought in that war and who was sorely affected by it, how much faith can the Australian public have in our military history when it is so regularly sanitised and corrupted?
Well, let's start with historian. Carolyn?
Thank you. Well, I mean, I would say in defence of historians, well, talking about academic historians, that we take a critical view about war and that you would get some more honest perspective looking at the evidence and certainly not sanitising things. And I must admit I'm surprised to hear that the War Memorial would be sanitising the evidence. There are another group of people who tend to write the history of the war and whose books tend to be more widely read than those written by academic historians, and they're the journalist historians. It's arguable that you get a more sentimental view of war in those kinds of books, but from my perspective, the problem that we have in Australia and that we've had for most of the time that we've sought to remember the First World War is that it's been contaminated by nationalism, and that started right from the very beginning, right from the moment that we charged the cliffs at Gallipoli and we declared that the nation was born. There was a period in the 1950s and 1960s, and so that Arthur referred to, where this idea of the martial baptism or the birth of the nation disappeared, but it's come roaring back in again, this idea that Australian values are represented by what happened in the trenches, and it's simply not true according to history. I mean, the nation was federated in 1901, and those values that we celebrate as being born in the trenches were in evidence in the 19th century, and certainly at Federation in those years, those grand years where we got off to a rip-roaring start as a federation. There were plenty of values that we recognise as quintessentially Australian there, but they tend to get lost behind Gallipoli.
I'm just going to quickly back to Don. I know a little bit of your backstory, so I've got the advantage on the panel. Just briefly tell us why it is you don't trust historians, particularly in the War Memorial.
Well, first of all, I was wounded in 1969 and hospitalised for more than 2 years. But my name did not appear on the records of the 9th Battalion, in which I was wounded for the best part of 28 years. And another unit that I fought in, called the 2nd D&E Platoon, was erased from all records of the Vietnam War for 38 years and was only formally put back into the record books by the Labor government in 2008 by by the Honourable Mike Kelly. And so that has affected me very badly, because people have said, well, you're a liar, you did not fight in the Vietnam War, you didn't fight in the 9th Battalion because your name's missing from the records, or you're a fraud because this platoon doesn't exist. And even today, the Australian War Memorial refuses to accept that this platoon did exist. And in fact, recently, I sought 235 documents from the Australian War Memorial that I know exist, and I took them to the Minister of Appeals Tribunal, and the Australian War Memorial enlisted the Australian government solicitor to defend its decision not to release these documents. So they will always be remaining never to be released to the Australian public.
Don, let's hear from Arthur Sinodinos, and I should add that something that Don actually sent us a letter, so He did get an unqualified apology in writing from Major General McLaughlin just this month, who's the head of strategic planning in the Army. So the big question here really is, are elements of the wars we fight in sanitised?
Well, that's a big question. I hadn't heard about this particular alleged sanitisation, Don, until you raised it. And I'm happy to follow it up with you and with Brendan Nelson at the War Memorial and find out what's really going on. Other than that, what I will say is that in a free society, you do get historians with very different perspectives on war. And you also get a capacity in a free society for those historians to talk directly to people who have been affected by war. So I think there is a capacity to get the different perspectives out there. And also from time to time, there are different historical traditions. And so events get interpreted in different ways. So look, I'm happy to follow that up because it is troubling to me. Often, with respect to the Defence Department, being the sort of organisation that it is, things can get lost in inverted commas, so it's more likely to be stuff up than conspiracy. But I'm happy to follow up with Brendan Nelson.
Okay, Tanya Plibersek wants to get in here, and I'll go briefly to her. Then we've got another question on a similar subject.
I was just going to say thank you for sharing that story. I think one of the things that the recent celebrations or commemorations of Anzac Day have done is actually tell some of the stories of groups that have been forgotten, not just your personal circumstances that you're describing, but for example, the fourth function I went to on Anzac Day was the Coloured Digger commemoration in Redfern, which tells the story of Aboriginal servicemen who weren't allowed to sign up during the First World War and did anyway, and went away and fought and came back and faced all of the same racism and discrimination.
They had to pretend they weren't Aboriginal.
They had to pretend they weren't Aboriginal. And I think my experience has been that these commemorations on Anzac Day are sober, they are reflective, they are not glorifying war. In fact, I think people who've served are much more interested in remembering their friends and I don't experience it as a glorification of war at all, but rather counting the cost of war. And an opportunity, I hope, to right some of these historical erasures.
Okay, on the issue of the cost of war, our next question is a video. It's from Peter Thornton in Canberra in the ACT.
I'm one of 29,000 civilian and permanently disabled TPI veterans. Over the decades, our compensation pay has diminished dramatically, to a point that our economic loss only equates to approximately 65% of the minimum wage. Outside of welfare supplementation, how are TPI veterans expected to live on that?
Yeah, Tim Fischer, and we should note for the audience, for anyone who doesn't know, that TPI stands for Total and Permanent Incapacity.
And there's EDIs and various other categories too, and clearly both sides of politics, the Australian government of the day has an absolute responsibility to look after our veterans and our wounded veterans and our TPIs. And yes, there was a slippage, and yes, there has been one lot of legislation go through since the last elections which corrected one of those slippages, but there is unfinished business, and I hope that a fair play will apply. It's the least we can do, because there is a commitment that you gave, you served, and you are now, by degrees, incapacitated. That's formally assessed, and you deserve recompense and support, and especially support in respect of post-traumatic stress disorder that is impacting too many.
Are you saying effectively 65% of the minimum wage is not enough?
Look, I won't go into the detail because it's a very complex area, but to be fair, there has been legislation that Michael Ronson brought in since the last elections which corrected one large area of slippage in the levels of pension to veterans. There are other areas yet to be rectified, and it is extremely complex. The principle should be a fair go, a fair outcome, and full support, especially to the wounded.
Arthur Sinodinos.
There were some changes after last election to the indexation of some of these payments, but I'm aware that veterans and retired military personnel have some further grievances in this regard. When they can be properly acknowledged or addressed, I'm not sure, in the current budgetary environment.
Are they more than grievances? I mean, do they have a very strong case for arguing that they've been left behind here?
Well, I think in sheer numerical terms they have been left behind, just based on the numbers that Peter and I think Tim have mentioned. The debate always is how far you can go over a period to rectify some of this.
And I suppose the obvious question is, does the government, no matter what the cost, owe it to them to actually rectify this?
And that's always the question, and we've done some things, and perhaps we need to go further in others, but that may not be possible in this particular budget.
Well, Tony, I think actually what the government's done, and Arthur will correct me if I'm wrong, is they've addressed the issue of the defined benefits pensions that some service personnel get. But with veterans' pensions and other related pensions, they've changed the indexation rate to make it a lower indexation rate. They've actually cut the indexation rate for those other types of pensions.
Carolyn.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. I would like to have a conversation about the amount of money that the Australian government is spending on commemorating Anzac in the First World War as compared to the amount of money that's being allocated to veterans in need. The Australian government is spending approximately $430 million on commemorating the First World War. A way to understand that is Canada is spending zero, absolutely nothing. The UK is spending about $90 million and France about $90 million. Germany, $7 million, so $430 million. So we need to have a public discussion about why Australia is spending so much money, what it's been spent on, and whether some of that money might not be better spent.
I was going to quickly go back to Don Tato, earlier question. I mean, you've heard that question. You were also shot. As you say, you spent 2 years recuperating, but I think you also ended up on a TPI, didn't you?
I am a TPI pension, and I would like to say, as a TPI veteran, that is a national disgrace what both governments have done to the veterans who fought for this country. Our pensions and our superannuations have been terribly eroded right through the years, and each party says that they will correct it when they come into power, and as soon as they do, they completely ignore it. It's it's a national disgrace.
Arthur, if you were to come back into power, that is into a ministry, would you fix it straight away?
You fix up the first bit and I'll try and fix the second bit.
I'll have to think about that for a minute.
And to take Carolyn's point, if I could very briefly, look, Albany received a National Anzac Centre. That is a worthwhile touchstone where 41,000 Australians on the AIF convoys saw Australia for the last time in their lives. Yes, the Prime Minister 1 day ago announced the Monash Centre at Villers-Bretonneux, and the reason Canada might be spending zero is they've already done their Vimy Ridge magnificent centre on the Western Front. It's about time Australia did have a centre on the Western Front, because this is about moving the focus, not taking away from Gallipoli, but finally bringing a focus to the Western Front, long overlooked in the Australian equation in respect of World War I.
All right, we're going to change the focus of the program. You're watching Q&A. It's a very different subject now. We've got a web question. It's from Paul Keary in Cherrybrook, New South Wales. And I guess it's to Tanya Plibersek. Why are you trying to compel Labor MPs to go against their conscience and vote for same-sex marriage?
Good question.
It seems like a very authoritarian and undemocratic thing to do, and will lose votes for the Labor Party.
Well, thanks.
Not my sentiment, Paul Keary's.
Thank you. Well, I believe that marriage equality is an issue of whether we support discrimination as a party or whether we don't. And we make a lot of decisions in the Labor Party and in the Liberal Party, in all political parties. After debate within parties, we make a decision and then we go out collectively and prosecute that decision. For me, the question is marriage equality something that should happen in Australia? Yes, it is. Do we support discrimination against one group in our community? We don't. I think this is an issue that's long overdue for change in Australia. More than 20 countries have marriage equality. I think for many people understand that marriage is a religious sacrament. I'm not proposing that churches should be forced to marry people, but it's more than a religious sacrament.
I'm going to bring you to the core of the question, though, is just to save a bit of time. I mean, because we have had the whole marriage equality debate talked about here. Why are you trying to compel Labor MPs to go against their conscience and vote for same-sex marriage? That was the question.
I'm not trying to compel them to go against their conscience. I'm saying that this should be an issue decided within the Labor Party based on whether we support discrimination against one group in our community or whether we don't. And I think we should say clearly as a party we don't support discrimination.
So you'd be aware one openly... One openly gay Senator, Dean Smith, who's a Conservative senator, says you've put the cause back with this move, that you've wrecked the slow and cautious approach, as he says, of achieving a conscience vote on his side of the aisle.
Well, I'm just not convinced by Dean Smith's claim that this was even under consideration in the Conservative Party room. Senator David Leyonhjelm had a private members bill a few weeks ago. He was told by members of the Liberal Party that introducing it would spark the debate they needed to have in their party room. It didn't do that. There's been no indication in the year and a half that the Conservatives have been in government that there's any move away from Tony Abbott's position before the election that it was no way to marriage equality.
Arthur Sinodinos?
Well, my friend and colleague Dean Smith is right. This will set it back because within the Liberal Party there's been increasing discussion about having a what's called a free vote or a conscience vote, and Tony Abbott had indicated it would be up to the party room to make a decision on that in due course. And
why would the party room be influenced by what Labor is contemplating doing?
Good question.
No, because, well, I'll tell you why. Because it would be much easier for the Liberal Party leadership to say, well, we're going to stick with our current policy because Labor is forcing its MPs to toe a particular line. Whereas if there is a conscience vote on the other side, it would be easier to persuade people within the Liberal Party for a conscience vote on our side. If the matter were to come up in the Liberal Party...
Is that because they would maintain the hope that it wouldn't get up because the numbers wouldn't be there?
No, this is not about strategy or anything. This is about getting people to be freely able to express themselves on this, because there will be people in the Labor Party, people, for example, aligned with the Shoppies Union, who wouldn't like the idea of being forced to vote for something that they don't believe in.
Tony, it's actually been Labor policy since 2011, since our national conference, to have a conscience vote. There's been no movement from the Liberal Party in that whole time to move away from their position, which is Tony Abbott's position, which is no to marriage equality.
You haven't quite explained why it's necessary to not have a conscience vote.
Because this is our conscience votes in the Labor Party are reserved for issues of life or death. There's a specific section in our national platform that deals with abortion. In the past, when euthanasia was debated in the federal parliament in response to the Northern Territory's laws, there was a conscience vote then. I don't think this is an issue in that category. I think this is an issue of legal discrimination against one group in our community. Do we have a conscience vote about whether we allow racism in our community? Do we have a conscience vote about whether we allow sexism or ageism? We don't. This is legal discrimination which prevents one group in our community accessing the legal rights and obligations that marriage confers, and it's discrimination that prevents one group in our community from accessing the social acknowledgement of their relationships, which in many cases are long-standing, loving, committed relationships.
Okay, thank you. It's going to leave that to the two politicians because it's a peculiarly political issue that we're talking about there. The next question is a video. It's from the Coptic Bishop of Melbourne, Dr. Ambar Suriel in Donvale, Victoria.
Tom Porteous, as a director of an international human rights organization, what do you think our role is as Australians in the protection of Christians in the Middle East? How can the people sitting around you help protect these ancient cultures who today suffer imprisonment, violence, and beheadings, filmed for all of the world to bear witness?
Tom Porteous.
Well, thank you very much for your question. I mean, the situation in the Middle East is absolutely terrible. I've been working on the countries of the Middle East for the last 4 years since the Arab Spring, and it's just been downhill in Syria, in Iraq, in Libya. And unfortunately, one of the consequences of this is the rise of ISIS. And I don't need to list the appalling abuses that ISIS are carrying out. And certainly the international community needs to do everything it can to stop those abuses. The problem with ISIS is that it doesn't respond to the sort of name and shame methodology that we certainly use, because they're actually proud of their abuses. They revel in them. So there needs to be a very forceful action. That's actually taking place at the moment, but it needs to also be action that itself observes the laws of war and human rights. The problem is, in 2011, we had a terrorist attack in the United States, and the United States and its allies declared a war on terror. In the course of that war, many serious violations took place.
2001.
2001, sorry, 2001, the 9/11. Many serious violations took place, partly as a result of the missteps that were taken in that war on terror, including very serious abuses, and the United States at one point authorized torture and still dealing with that legacy. We're now in a situation which is probably worse than it was in 2001. So we need to accept responsibility in some sense for the mistakes that have been made. And I think, you know, this goes back to what we were talking about before, about the need to have a serious debate about military strategy and about our armed forces and about the decisions that are taken, the mistakes that are made, the abuses that are committed in the name of fighting the war on terror. It's absolutely essential that we put aside the old mentality which says, you know, the situation is too complicated, the situation is too violent, the crisis is too serious, we need to focus on national security, we need to focus on counterterrorism. Human rights is something that can be left as a luxury. No, human rights is absolutely central to what's going on here. We have repressive governments throughout the Middle East that are actually stirring the problem up. So we must deal with ISIS and their ilk on the one hand, but we must also deal with the repression, which is exactly the other side of the same coin.
Arthur Sinodinos, do you accept the kind of general thesis that the growth of ISIS is in a way a response to the American war in Vietnam?
In Vietnam?
Sorry,
you mean
Iraq?
The
American war in Iraq. I'm sorry, it was going back to previous question.
I've no doubt that the war in Iraq contributed to the sort of instability that Tom mentions as a potential breeding ground for this. But the fact of the matter is, during the Arab Spring, we had a number of dictators fall in Syria and in Libya. This created conditions which were also fertile ground for these terrorist organisations, whether it's Al-Qaeda or this mutation of ISIS or Daesh or whatever it's called, to come into being. And while there were mistakes in Iraq, I don't think the West should be blamed for the rise of these sorts of groups. People in the Middle East have got to take some responsibility for what happens in the Middle East. And what's important for us is to contain the damage potentially for us, which is why we're trying to fight over there as opposed to just fighting them over here. I agree with Tom that we shouldn't have truck with authoritarian regimes, but where do you start in the Middle East? And the fact of the matter is, we fought authoritarian regimes in the Middle East in the past, like the one in Iraq, which was gassing its own people, which was committing genocide against the Kurds, against the Shia majority, and look where it got us. So the fact of the matter is, you can't fight on all fronts. At least here, we're trying to contain the matter to Iraq with the cooperation of the Iraqi government, and hopefully a government that has learnt its lessons about the need to provide a more inclusive government which more equitably shares the resources of the country, and hopefully with them at the front and us and the US and the others supporting it, we will get somewhere. The other obligation we have with our own Islamic communities, and this is where I think this is an important point, is to maximise inclusiveness so that we are always supporting those elements within our local Islamic and Muslim communities who are seeking to stand up against the potential siren call of radicalism. And that does require us to be measured in our speech and in our talk about these issues. And you're right to say that we should always maintain a firm focus on our human rights, because we don't want to get to a point where in the name of fighting terrorism, we abrogate the very values that we are seeking to defend. It's a very important balance, and we have to be careful with national security legislation that while we do what we can to assure the public, we don't go so far that we negate the very values that we stand for in the West.
Arthur, we're nearly out of time, and just reflecting on the fact that was a Coptic Christian archbishop. You'd be aware, I'm sure, that some of your senior colleagues would like to see a bigger intake of Christian refugees into Australia. Do you support that?
I support a global non-discriminatory immigration policy. When it comes to refugees, we should assess them on their merits. I'm wary of the idea of saying, well, we should give a particular precedence to one group over another because of either their ethnicity or their religious background. I think at the end of the day, it has to be based on need, their need.
But surely, with regard to extreme fundamentalism, zero tolerance. Absolutely zero tolerance applies.
Tanya Plibersek.
Well, I agree with Arthur. I think that our humanitarian intake should be based on the greatest need, and I think at this time a lot of those people will come from the communities that we're talking about, Coptic Christians, Chaldeans, there's a range, Yazidis and others in Iraq at the moment, and of course, considering the particular vulnerability of women in this conflict as well. We should be taking more refugees, full stop. In recent years, we have reduced the number to a degree. I welcomed the government's announcement that they are moving to a higher number again, but we should be taking more people.
I'm sorry to say that I'm told we've gone over time. That's all we have time for tonight. 2 quick notes before we go. Stay with ABC TV straight after Q&A tonight, and we'll have the latest news on the last-ditch legal challenge by the Bali 9 duo that we were referring to earlier. And just to follow up on last week's program, there was an enormous response to the question from Ethan Eggart about his friend Tyrone Sevilla. Well, today the Immigration Minister, Peter Dutton, received a petition from over 122,000 people, and he's indicated he's looking positively at letting Tyrone, 10-year-old boy with autism, stay in Australia. Please thank our panel. Thank you. Just save your applause for a moment because I want you to thank our panel, Tim Fischer, Tanya Plibersek, Arthur Sinodinos, Carolyn Holbrook and Tom Porteous. Thank you very much indeed. Now, next week, next Monday, in fact, Q&A will be joined by the Australian philosopher and ethicist Peter Singer, Environment Minister Greg Hunt, Shadow Environment Minister Mark Butler, broadcaster and commentator Amanda Vanstone, and American comedian Adrian Truscott, who's in Australia to perform her provocative one-woman show about sexual assault. Until next week's Q&A, good night.